Today's video. Today is Wednesday, August 14th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the state of the race according to the polls. Tomorrow I'll be releasing my August 15th election prediction. We are now getting into the time frame where I'm releasing election predictions every 2 weeks for the presidential election, the Senate election. I don't do a House election forecast, but we'll talk about that in over the next coming days. Pretty much though, what I wanted to do in the day before my election prediction is understand the current state of the polls nationally. It's a great thing that we've been seeing a lot more coverage and a lot more polls just across many battleground states. It is always a good thing to have far more information rather than less. But when it comes down to where we have Biden, Trump, Harris, over the past 3 months, we haven't seen as many polls averaged in a way that gives us a general understanding of where we are today. And so luckily, over the past month, since a whole number of polls have been conducted, we are now at a point where a number of battleground states, in fact, the majority of them, have averages that help us understand the current state of the race. And when you're seeing news articles like this, left and right, talking about how Donald Trump is losing battleground states, how Donald Trump is losing ground in these extremely important swing states, you have to understand that a lot of this is contributing to an average on the national level and also on the swing state level that can show you exactly where we are according to the data. Now, I will first say, I do not believe polls are going to be, the best predictors of this election. I think there are far more factors that can be considered in understanding the way that the American public might go. But they are certainly a very good gauge of public sentiment. Because while they do have their inaccuracies, and I will never say they are perfect, I do think for the most part, in 90% of cases, especially recently, they tend to be accurate. And if not accurate, show general trend lines that can explain why Democrats may have been down in May and June of 2024 that are now up today. And so on our map here, what we're using is the FiveThirtyEight national average and swing state average across battleground states. Thankfully, because again, of a lot of these new polls here, FiveThirtyEight now has the ability to average a lot of the data that we're working with for an electoral map like this. And so on your screen right now is the current state of the race with 0 electoral votes to either candidate, showing that 203 electoral votes worth of states currently have polls conducted in them that give us a general understanding of a Trump versus Harris matchup for this November. Now, you might see some states on here that you are surprised to see no polls have been commissioned since Kamala Harris has won the nomination, since Kamala Harris has been introduced as the Democratic nominee for president. And this includes states like Iowa and Virginia that in 2012 were some of the most closely watched states of the 2012 election that now today aren't even on the top priority list, contrary with states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia when it comes down to major pollsters. When they're using their money and they're spending their time understanding a race and diving deep into a race, Iowa, Colorado, Virginia don't seem to be at the forefront of many people's minds, and it also just may be a combination of other factors that contribute to our polling drought in these battleground states. But beyond that, the majority of battleground states absolutely have polls conducted in them. And so what we're going to do here for all the states that do not have any polls conducted, we're going to spend our time right now characterizing them as they voted in the last election, because that gives us a better gauge of where these states were already going to go and pretty much shows exactly why we don't really need many of these states to be polled. For instance, the majority of the states that have just characterized thus far have been safe Democrat. There's a reason that you don't see reputable pollsters going into states like Oregon and Maryland. And to be fair, the characterization I used here to determine if the polls were conducted or not are swing states. But generally speaking, we do not waste time or money in states that do not need to be polled because we generally know these states are going to go to Democrats and many other states are going to go to Republicans regardless of who the nominee is going to be. And so because of this increasingly polarized time, we can pretty much guess for the majority of these states exactly how they're going to go based on recent election history without a single bit of data for this election. And so for those states that don't have that luxury, like Iowa, Virginia, and Colorado, we're going to revert back and look at the 2020 presidential election. So Virginia went to Joe Biden by 10.1%. That's going to be a likely characterization for Kamala Harris. Iowa went to Donald Trump by nearly the same amount, going to be a likely characterization for Donald Trump. Nebraska's second went to the Democrats by 7 points, keeping that characterization, and Colorado went to Biden by 14 points statewide, going to keep that likely blue characterization. So beyond that, Donald Trump at 131 electoral votes, Kamala Harris at 204. Everything is going to come down to these battleground states. And luckily for us, we have data points in all of the remaining yellow states. And so what I'm going to do now is go ahead and just get rid of this, candidate here, this in theory candidate, and allow us and bring us back to 203 toss-up electoral votes, and pretty much go state by state in analyzing and understanding the current state of the race and why the polling numbers might be showing Democrats or Republicans doing quite well in certain regions of the country. What we're going to start off with are some of the states that are a little bit less competitive, and that way we can spend our time talking about the core 7, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, and spend less time talking about states that, sure, in theory, are going to be competitive, and we'll see some amounts of money and time spent in the races, but aren't going to be the most important factors in this election. So to kick us off, we are going to start off in the top of the United States with Maine at large here. Maine at large is surprisingly has been polled, but also was competitive back in 2016. Very good House race to watch there in Maine's 2nd district. And so it did get a poll of Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, which actually had some pretty interesting results. Maine at large went to Kamala Harris by roughly 9 points, Maine's 1st district by 20 points plus. But Maine's 2nd district, on average here, has Donald Trump ahead by just 3 points. Now, to set the stage, Maine's 2nd district back in 2020 went to Donald Trump by nearly 10 points. In 2016, it was over 10 points. And so to see this reduction here, I think sort of speaks to what we might see exhibited across some of these battleground states. Now, granted, Donald Trump has made improvements in some of these states relative to 2020. In some of these battleground states, Donald Trump will, in fact, be performing better based on what the averages show in the battlegrounds. But that makes sense. Some states have moved away from Kamala Harris, and some states were more invested in by Biden and his campaign in 2020 compared to what they are expecting to invest in and have invested in this cycle. So with 190 remaining toss-up electoral votes, let's continue to some states that aren't as competitive but have battleground state polls. The next state that comes to mind is the state of Ohio. Now, its counterpart, Iowa, which they voted together in 2004, 2008, 2012, and 2016, and 2020, will very well do again in 2024, with Donald Trump taking an advantage of 9.5%. Now, I will caution this. If you guys are as terminally online as me, you will know that there is an internal poll that was talked about in the New York Times and on election Twitter, an internal poll, and a few internal polls, rather, that have been conducted by Republicans, thus the term internal, Republican pollsters, that showed Donald Trump below 50% in Ohio. Now, that isn't to say that Kamala Harris is going to be competitive in Ohio, and all the public-facing polls show him ahead by 9.5% on average, but I think it might show us that if any of these numbers leak or any of the public polls find similar results over the next coming weeks, that Ohio might be more competitive than we think, but I don't think it's a worthwhile investment for the Kamala Harris campaign. Just something to think about when we're looking at that state. So it brings Donald Trump to a 9.5% in Ohio, brings him up to 149 electoral votes. Let's continue across the map here. Texas might surprise some of you in that it has Donald Trump ahead on average by 7 points against Kamala Harris. That's a pretty strong result for the former president, given that he won the state by 5.6%. But back in 2020, with the excess of money that Democrats had, they actually seemed to make a play in theory for Texas, not to win it tremendously, but they certainly did spend some money on advertisements and focused on the state in a way that was quite surprising. They didn't go all in, and many Democrats had hoped they would, given that the Rust Belt seemed to have been locking up, but the Biden campaign had stayed the course. They knew it would be smart to focus on Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. They even invested in Ohio. They invested in Iowa. But now that the campaign is more focused and narrow-lensed into 7 battleground states rather than 13, Texas has made the axe. And overall, Donald Trump has made a slight improvement of his 2020 margin, and I think that can be for a lack of trying from the Democratic side. Another state, though, that shares a similar margin is the state of Minnesota, that shows Kamala Harris with an average 7-point advantage. Now, with Tim Walz on the ticket, I think this increases. I think he's the governor who has a high approval rating, won in 2022, did very well even in 2018, was a Trump district congressman, Republican district congressman. And so Tim Walz added to Minnesota, I think really will help the Kamala Harris ticket, bringing her to well above 7% in Minnesota, but that runs roughly even with where Biden was back in 2020, which is a good sign for this election, I should say. Now, that brings Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to 217 electoral votes. Now let's move over to another big state, the state of Florida. From Texas to Florida, they share a characterization, and that is a likely red victory, with Donald Trump narrowly ahead by 5.1, 5.2% on average. A pretty strong showing for Donald Trump, but not as strong as it was in 2022 by a long shot. In 2022, Republicans won here by 20 points statewide. Donald Trump being ahead by 5 is an indicator that Florida is improving for Republicans and that it's becoming more of a Republican safe haven, Republican advantage state, potentially equivalent to the Democratic Party's California. But again, California is Harris plus 25, 30, Florida is Trump plus 5. So very, very different things. But But in terms of overall electoral capacity, Florida is a very massive state. Democrats invested over $100 million to win the state back in 2016 and 2020, lost it both times. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, Ron DeSantis and the Republicans across the state have demolished the Democratic Party, not only in elections, but in voter registration, in enthusiasm. And so in 2024, while Kamala Harris has rebounded that enthusiasm and excitement for Democrats, Donald Trump's victories in 2016 and 2020 make Obama's victories in Florida look like child's play. What we saw in 2022 made Trump's victories look like child's play. And so in 2024, I'm not shocked at all that Republicans have a 5-point lead in Florida. Contrary to what some people might think about the state, it's still very much Republican territory. And so that narrows us down to 102 toss-up electoral votes. I want to get over to New Mexico because it also shares a 7-point characterization, which is a bit of a reduction for Kamala Harris. I think maybe this can speak to the fact that since 2020, we've seen some levels of reduced support amongst minority voters, specifically Latino voters, and specifically on the issue of immigration and the southern border. That is where the Biden-Harris administration polls the weakest. Biden polled the weakest. Harris polls the weakest. That issue is really kryptonite for the Democratic Party. Where would it matter the most? In battleground border states. New Mexico included. A narrowing up to 7 points means that maybe Democrats need to consider some level of, entrance, or maybe holding a rally or two in the state, or doing some level of advertisement spending. But right now, New Mexico is still a likely blue state, so it's a 3-point reduction. But on the overall net, Kamala Harris does come out ahead in some of these other battleground states. So very contrasting opinions here. And again, polls are just snapshots in time. They're not always going to be direct indicators of what might happen in November. But it's interesting to watch nonetheless. So narrowing down to our 97 electoral votes, let's get New Hampshire out of the way. Then we're actually down to our 7 core battleground states. New Hampshire has Kamala Harris up by 6 on average. Biden won this state by 7, a 1-point difference here, but largely running even in some of these states like Minnesota, with Joe Biden's margin of victory. So New Hampshire, likely blue, brings her to 226. Donald Trump still at 219. So here we are. 93 remaining toss-up electoral votes. And again, we have heard constantly that Kamala Harris has done quite well in many of these battleground polls, and that is the reality we are in right now. If I was to take a look at the polls of Biden versus Trump back right before he dropped out of the race, even on the day that he dropped out of the race, he would be losing all of these battleground states that are currently characterized as toss-up. I kid you not. He would be down in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina, in Georgia, in Arizona, in Nevada, and it would be 312 to 226. In fact, that was my map. In my last election prediction of Joe Biden versus Donald Trump on the day right before he dropped out, about 2 weeks before Joe Biden departed the race, this was my election prediction. And I'm not here to say that I was just following the polls. In fact, they slipped a little bit further afterwards. But I do think they were indicative of a national trend and an overall shift in sentiment that was not good for the president. And because Democrats and Republicans are really capped in terms of their ability to win largely, lose largely, whatever it might be, 312 was really the peak for Donald Trump. It really is the peak for Donald Trump at this election. And so across these battleground states here, the polls really showed that Joe Biden was not doing well. But let me be the first to tell you, and I'm sure I'm not, but let me tell you, Kamala Harris has made massive, massive gains in these battleground states. And we're going to start off with some of the larger leads and work our way down into some of the more competitive ones. And I think you will find this very, very interesting as we track across our electoral map. And so here we are. The first state that has the largest advantage, you might find this surprising, for either of the two candidates is the state of Wisconsin, which currently has Kamala Harris ahead by 3.5% in this state. Now, you might find this to be the most surprising, because Wisconsin, and I don't think it'll be the most surprising as we get through the map here, but it will be certainly very surprising, because Wisconsin went to Biden by 0.6%. Now, if Kamala Harris is up by 3.5%, that is a stellar sign for the campaign, and I'm sure you will see throughout the remainder of this video how stellar of a sign this actually is, but it's a 3.5% advantage. 236 electoral votes for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. Wisconsin goes from being Biden plus 0.6 to Harris plus 3.5. Now, I do think this is a combination of things. I think Tim Walz, being a neighboring state, Midwestern governor that they know and love, his approvals are really strong in Wisconsin and across the nation. It was the right pick for Kamala Harris, and it does numbers in Wisconsin. And I think that's the direct response we're seeing here. It also helps that Kamala Harris combats, again, those age concerns. Wisconsin actually is one of the few states that held out strong for Joe Biden. Even though he was losing the average, he was losing by less than a point. So when Kamala Harris comes in with this new energy, a new surge, Wisconsin becomes the state that becomes most favored for Kamala Harris, even if the historical numbers may not project it as so. And so Wisconsin joins that rank. Michigan, as the neighboring state, has Kamala Harris up by just slightly under of a 3.4% average here. So Kamala Harris being up by 3.4 in Michigan, 3.5 in Wisconsin, you start to see the way that this goes. Really good numbers for Kamala Harris and entirely predictable given where Biden's pitfalls were in these battleground states. So Wisconsin, Michigan brings Kamala Harris to 251 electoral votes. Believe it or not, the state with the next largest characterization out of Pennsylvania, out of North Carolina, out of Georgia, out of Nevada, out of all of these battleground states, the states with the next highest characterization for either of the two is, out of any of the five, is Pennsylvania, which completes the trifecta here with Kamala Harris ahead by 2.1%. This is a massive improvement off of where Biden was. And it also goes to show that this state is turning in favor of the Democratic Party quite tremendously. Pennsylvania being locked down, Michigan being locked down, Wisconsin being locked down. These aren't safe numbers, not even likely numbers, but they're much, much, much stronger than where Biden was. And it shows that consistently these three states always vote together, have voted together in every election since 1992, and you will find here that they are voting again together in 2024, according to the data we're working with. So 270 already, Kamala Harris wins the presidency alone, but I'm here to tell you as well that she is not done yet based on these polling averages from 538. So the next state I'm going to move to is the state of North Carolina, where Donald Trump takes a 2-point lead statewide. A 2-point lead in North Carolina. He actually won the state by just under 1.5. So this is a minor improvement for Donald Trump. Again, some of these states don't show consistency in the sense that the overall trend from 2020 is an improvement for Kamala Harris, but she doesn't need that. And it also comes into play. The Biden campaign was already doing well in the Rust Belt relative to many other battlegrounds. Biden was down 7 in North Carolina while down 2 in Michigan. He was down 6 in Nevada while tied in Wisconsin. That's a shift, sure, from 2020. Very favorable to Republicans, but more tame in the Rust Belt, which can explain why her numbers are better in the Rust Belt. But North Carolina narrowing down from where it was for Biden. Again, Biden was down 6-7 points, Harris being down 2, and a good sign today from a new poll from Cook Little Report showing her up 1 point in the state is definitely something the Democrats should look at as an opportunity to swoop in and potentially do really well in that battleground state. So this brings us to 235 for Donald Trump. There's not many more ways for Donald Trump to narrow up this map. It would require a clean sweep of Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. He does get that advantage boost in the state of Nevada right now, where Donald Trump has a 0.2% advantage. Now, this is not the next closest state, but I am going to say that it is the state that is the most surprising given our electoral map here. But I do have to caution this by saying, back in 2020, Trump led on the national average, on the statewide average in Nevada on Election Day. In 2016, Trump led in the statewide average on Nevada on Election Day. In both elections, Democrats won it on the presidential level. In 2018, Jackie Rosen, now the incumbent Democratic senator from the state, was losing to Republican Dean Heller. What happened? Not only did she win, she won by 5, defied the polls and expectations. In 2022, Democratic Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, the incumbent right now, was supposed to lose her race to Adam Laxalt, the former Republican Attorney General, according to the polls. What happened? She won across the state, swinging it 3 points to the left over that, compared to what the polls had predicted. Why am I telling you this? I think Donald Trump's lead in Nevada is not rooted in reality. I do think the polls in Nevada have had a very strong historical accuracy in the level that if we shift them over in favor to the Democratic Party by just a few points, that's typically the result that we see. And so Nevada is so interesting that it almost always underestimates Democrats and has without fail in the past 4 election cycles, 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2020. And I would not be shocked if it happened again in 2024. But again, sticking to where we are by the books, Donald Trump has a narrow advantage in Nevada. But I think that can explain a bit of the reason why it might be shocking to see Nevada as a red state when Biden won Nevada by larger than he did in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania in 2020. But it may actually be more in favor of Kamala Harris than we think. The final 2 states to characterize, Arizona and Georgia. Kamala Harris has a narrow lead in both. 0.7% lead in Arizona, making it a tilt blue state, and a 0.1% lead in Georgia. Now, I could not find more fitting numbers than those for these battleground states. I think if it was to see a reality in which Kamala Harris wins either of these two, those could be spot on. And my reasoning is simple. Arizona has become more Democrat, and so has Georgia. However, I will say that Arizona has moved at a faster pace. We have found here that because of Maricopa County, Democrats have started to do even better in governor races, Senate races, House races, whereas Georgia has fallen a bit behind. States that ran roughly even in 2020 and 2022, Arizona was clearly more Democrat. Georgia ended up electing Brian Kemp, the Republican, by 7 points, and their Senator Raphael Warnock by 2 points against a candidate who was arguably more beatable and more crazy than Blake Masters, who lost by 5 in Arizona. Not to mention that Democrats won the governor's race in Arizona after losing it by 14 points just 4 years prior. Arizona, I think, is more Democrat than Georgia, and I think it's more within reach. But I think both are within reach, and it is fascinating to now see the polls actually say that for the first time this entire election cycle. We've spent the past 3.5 years seeing Joe Biden lose to Donald Trump in hypothetical rematch election scenarios. Poll after poll over the past 6 months showed Joe Biden losing almost every battleground state without fail. There were some that showed him doing well. There were some that provided hope for the Democratic campaign, and there were certainly some that suggested, even up to the election, that this race, no matter what, would be close, because we are a polarized nation and people do not want Donald Trump to be the next president. But they didn't want Joe Biden either. Now we're starting to see a change. Georgia and Arizona, for the first time ever, now have Democrats leading. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are now consistent and unified in having Democrats leading for the first time ever this cycle. And that matters. While Nevada may be out there and saying that Kamala Harris is losing to Donald Trump, overall, these are really good numbers for Kamala Harris. And they actually outpace my most recent election prediction that I released roughly 2 weeks ago. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz together do justice to the Democratic ticket. They bring back the energy. In Tim Walz's words, they bring back the joy the Democrats haven't had since Obama's election in 2012 and potentially even 2008. And while we aren't on track for an Obama 2012 or not even a 2008 victory, we are on track right now for a Democratic victory, a Kamala Harris presidency for at least 4 years. And Georgia and Arizona now joining that bunch really go to show that there have been improvements for the Democratic ticket, ones that cannot be denied. Now, 297 to 241 again would be a strong performance for Democrats, but their weakest performance in any of their winning elections in the 21st century. But this election was engineered to be so exceptionally narrow. Kamala Harris is a strong candidate for the Democratic Party, and the polls very clearly reflect that. I'll be fascinated to see how these polls change over the coming weeks and coming months as we steam right ahead into the 2024 election. But as of right now, based on the polling averages in every single state, Kamala Harris wins the presidency with 297 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 241. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below, subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.